Good afternoon. The time is now 3:30. We'll open the City of Norwood Planning Commission. Mrs. Town, would you please call the roll?
Chairman Powers,
Present.
Mayor Schneider,
Present.
Mrs. Sickinger,
Present.
Mr. Hockney, Mr. Sewer.
Present.
Moving to item B, approval of the agenda. Have one addition to make, item D1, just an update for the members on the status of the zoning ordinance amendment before council. Go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion that we approve the agenda as amended.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Mrs. Town, would you please call the roll?
Chairman Powers,
Yes?
Mrs. Sickinger,
Yes.
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer.
Yes.
Moving on to item C, approval of the minutes of the October 4th, 2023 meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion that the October 4th Planning Commission minutes be approved as if read.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that motion.
Mrs. Town, would you please call the roll?
Chairman Powers,
Yes?
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Mrs. Sickinger,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer.
Yes.
Moving on to item D1, new business, update on the zoning ordinance amendment. So the first reading of the amendment was given at the council meeting this past week. Some questions were made about the electric vehicle charging stations. Mr. Skelly is preparing a memorandum on that to be provided back to council. We're working to coordinate that, make sure it says what it needs to say to get council's questions answered. And then that will be on for a second reading at the next council meeting. Any questions, comments? Would everybody like a copy of Mr. Skelly's memo when it's available?
I would love to see it.
Okay, we will make sure that gets out to everybody.
No, BZA the members may ask me, when is the next, is it council meeting every other Tuesday?
Almost. The council meetings are the second and the fourth Tuesday.
Second and the fourth.
So on
So
rare
they're not-
occasion,
They're not 30 days apart for the readings.
correct.
Okay,
So
they
on-
can be the next council meeting.
Yeah, each reading can be on the successive council.
Okay.
And
I don't know
on-
why I thought they had to wait 30 days to, okay,
We could be the next night.
Yeah, they can do 3 meetings in 3 days if they wanted to.
okay. Thank you.
I think they could do a breakfast, lunch, and dinner meeting if they really wanted to get it all done.
Okay, thank you.
So there is the rare occasion where we have 5 Tuesdays in the month, and that puts them more than 2 weeks apart.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else for new business? Hearing none, move on to item E1, old business. Review proposed ordinance, language amending Part 11 Planning and Zoning Code relating to short-term residential rentals, lodging, and businesses. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Skelly to discuss what was done there.
Sure. Good afternoon. Thank you. So following last month's meeting where we had a document for discussion purposes, there was a few comments that were made, and following that, I had discussions with the chair. And tonight, or this afternoon, you actually have a revised draft document dated October 5th, which essentially boils it down a bit further. The recital is almost as long as the actual policies, and it really comes down to what you pretty much saw at the last meeting. We're recommending that short-term rentals not be permitted in the R1 through R3 and the RMX zone, and they would be permitted in the 4 commercial zones, subject to 6 criteria. So you have the 4-page document in front of you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I will add, I did not receive any formal inquiries or phone calls or emails regarding concerns. I did have this afternoon discussion with a resident who also has rental property as to potential impacts to her property and to others, and we discussed it, but at this point, I have not received any formal documentation, concerns, objections so far from anyone, so I don't know if the building department has received anything.
No, but other than the agenda being posted, it's not been put out for public notice.
I did receive a letter at my office on this addressed to the Planning Commission. I'll go ahead and read that quickly, and we can provide copies of that. Were copies given to everyone? I think it just,
I didn't receive it.
okay, it only came directly to me. Subject, formal citizen input advocating for the positive impact of short-term rentals in Norwood. Dear honorable members of the Norwood Planning Commission, due to scheduling constraints, I am unable to participate in regularly scheduled meetings. However, I have a strong interest in contributing to discussions about Norwood's future. I respectfully request that this letter be included in your meeting records as a form of remote citizen input, if your policies allow. Purpose of this letter is to express support for Airbnb and other short-term rental services as beneficial additions to Norwood's housing market. These platforms can fulfill several important roles. They supplement our limited hotel availability and boost local commerce by directing business toward our restaurants and shops. Quality is often higher in Airbnb rentals compared to traditional lodging options. Owners depend on positive reviews and are therefore motivated to provide high standard amenities and maintenance. This applies more heavily to short-term rentals than traditional rental units. My personal travel preferences further attest to this. I exclusively use Airbnb for the neighborhood experience and to support local businesses. Norwood is a city with a significant number of rental properties. The shift toward a higher rate of home ownership could be facilitated by improving the quality of existing rentals. Short-term rental platforms can drive this improvement by attracting private investment. I would personally support such a transition in my own neighborhood where poorly maintained properties could become well-kept rentals. Ultimately, investment will help create conditions more favorable to owner occupancy in the future while also preserving existing housing stock. While the aim to increase owner-occupied homes is understandable, direct intervention from the city is a complex matter. A market-driven approach led by private investment in short-term rentals can enhance property standards without additional regulation. I would also like to point out that the negative aspects often attributed to short-term rentals are overemphasized in public discourse. Local law enforcement is well equipped to handle any issues, such as noise complaints, just as they would for long-term rental properties. If specific short-term rentals become a chronic nuisance, there are already methods in place to address them as any other repeat offenders are handled. In conclusion, I believe that short-term rentals offer a straightforward path to improve our existing houses while we work on making Norwood more attractive for long-term home ownership. Supporting this sector encourages private investment in our community, which is preferable to more burdensome regulation. Sincerely, B. Otto Weaver, 5322 Globe Avenue, Norwood, Ohio, 45212. So, Mrs. Town, I'll provide this letter to you to be entered into the official record. Thank you, Mr. Skelly.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Mr. Scully, I do have one question on page 3, item C. You have a section highlighted there. It's both a question and a comment. I suppose the comment being that I would agree with including that language. I think that's a more permissive use. It allows BZA the opportunity to review and allow expanding that in certain cases. What would be your comment on that?
Yeah, so the purpose of the highlighter was just to draw attention to that particular section. I can't recall if it was a discussion that you and I maybe had with regards to that flexibility. I think earlier on it might have been the inclusion of a much larger, longer definition. So it was just, I guess, bringing the Planning Commission's attention to at least having that availability. So the board could consider that as some sort of a relief.
Thank you.
No, questions?
Yes.
Mike? Mike, underneath the criteria, and I assume Dan had a chance to at least skim this?
Not yet. I don't know if it was a
Oh, okay,
circulated.
that's fine.
Yeah, so the first document was just discussions, but my hope is that once you guys are comfortable, we could either do one of two things, provide at least a official circulation. I believe I did circulate it to the fire department. If they wanted to see it, but beyond that, then we could either do that or actually authorize it for the public hearing. And then that would also be formally circulated to all departments.
So I just want to make sure, from Dan Bly's standpoint, as an application comes in, the BZA cannot approve short-term rental in 4 areas. That's not what you're trying to say. I'm trying to make sure I understand.
That being the R1, R2, R3, and R mix.
Yes. Or are you saying with an applicant meeting the 6 criteria, even if they're in the R district, a conditional use can be approved? I'm just,
Sure. So in page 2, there's a brief chart, and under the boxes for R1 through RMX, it would be intended as strictly prohibited, like not allowed whatsoever.
and I think that's been our discussion to date.
Correct.
So I'm just wondering, and again, not being critical of your drafting, the criteria, it gave me the impression almost that if you meet this criteria, the BZA has the opportunity, and maybe we should just make sure that that's not the intent.
Sure. To me, I guess the path forward and returning to the chart. So if someone had, let's say, a residential type building within the O office zone, they would be permitted, but it's a qualified, I don't want to use the word conditional because that has the connotation of conditional use, which goes to the BZA. But they would have to meet the criteria in order to then have the assurance that they would have a lawfully erected short-term rental. One thing, just to clarify, and I think I said that Dan Bly wasn't consulted with it earlier, and actually he did, because one of his comments earlier was specifying, I think, the language for the kitchen.
The kitchen.
Yeah. So again, he has seen the earlier discussion. What he hasn't seen, I don't think, this one yet.
Mr. Skelly, if I could, I think what may clear some of this up is on the criteria C, it is essentially limiting it to owner-occupied or tenant-occupied facilities, except that the BZA would be empowered to grant a variance from that. Is that correct? So if you are an owner-occupied 3-unit, you would be able to make 1 or 2 of those units into the short-term rental. If you owned a commercial building that you did not occupy, you would go to the BZA for that approval. Is that correct?
Correct. For having, just to clarify, to have an off-site or non-occupant property manager.
Yes.
For lack of a better word.
But they wouldn't go to BZA for a single family?
I think for a single family, it would also go to BZA, the way that I read this, because it would not be occupied by the owner or the leaseholder. Well, I suppose if you were doing it only as a room rather than a separate unit, then I don't think it would require BZA approval.
So as a room, it would be sharing the kitchen of the main house?
Yes.
To me, one way to look at it, just how things might have occurred over the years. You would have a single-family structure that was built and created and maintained, and then for whatever reason, there's either fully or partially living quarters in that single-family structure that someone is renting out occasionally, almost like an accessory use or home occupation. So it's ancillary to the single family.
Mother-in-law suites, which typically have a shared component. There are very few that I know of.
Any other questions, comments?
Just a question, I guess, more, Mike, what do you think about the short-term rentals? This doesn't really address existing short-term rentals that are, and the city has done a certain process to date.
Correct.
It doesn't-
You're right, correct, so you're absolutely right, and I would say, your question is more like, I would say, you know, assistant law director, it's more of a fundamental, like zoning law, in terms of usually you cannot have retroactive policies or retroactive zoning ordinances that it'll impact existing, either legal non-conforming that have gone through the process. So I believe there could be, you know, 24 or so, maybe slightly more existing short-term rentals in Norwood right now. Those would not be impacted by this proposed policy.
That's correct.
Only if they weren't permitted. If they weren't permitted,
Yeah,
we would handle that as a totally new case.
correct, if there were not.
We have 3 that have gone through the process.
So, whatever the right number, I agree with you that it seemed like it's not a lot, but it's,
Yeah,
But we have a lot more on the map if you Google it.
okay. Okay, well, I think it's just something you're gonna have to address, the grandfathering in. They're gonna come in and say, you know, we applied 2 years ago and got permission from the city and da-da-da-da-da, so.
and I think when we started the discussion, so whatever, a couple of years before, Terry, please correct me if I'm wrong, there was an interpretation made where these would be considered like lodgings. So as long as they were in a zone that permitted lodging, which would be the R3, it was considered acceptable.
Correct. So these existing in R1 and R2, where we do not permit lodging, we would still be able to enforce those under the current existing zoning ordinance.
So when we did that, then that's why I asked about this last year or the year before, because I needed something more. We treated it in the building department as a change of use, just like if somebody said, I want to turn my house into a hotel. And they went through all the process to do that.
Yes.
So right now, we have, I think, 3 that did that process, which if this is passed, would make them non-conforming uses, but they're allowed to be there as long as they're there. The rest of them are there without any formal documentation. I'm sorry.
Any further discussion or comment? That leaves us to decide which direction we would like to go. Do we want to solicit additional input? Do we want to set this for a public hearing?
So I'm assuming the 3 that are registered haven't had any problems with their neighbors. Is that accurate?
I do not know.
I believe there was a lady here last month about one of them that was registered, that you spoke with after the meeting.
I did.
Because if the 3 are gonna be grandfathered in, would it make sense to do something like an advisory board? Where the 3, is it the same 3 people that own the same, 3 different people that are registered have an advisory board where they could give feedback so that this doesn't happen, or things that we could avoid, or, I don't know. Because they're gonna be here anyway.
They will, that's correct.
So what is all of this doing?
This would not be applicable to those currently existing, but it would be applicable to those that would come down the road. If there are problems with the ones that exist now, we would have to use the ordinances we have on the books. So if they become a nuisance, we would deal with them through that. Would we like to set this for a public hearing, or would we like to solicit additional input from Mr. Bly and departments.
As a courtesy to Dan Bly, I think giving him the opportunity to see what we have, working with Mike, have come up with before it moves forward seems to make sense. I mean, Dan is the first person, as a request comes in, that looks at these, and he very well, knowing Dan, he may go through this and say, wait a minute, Mike, we need to add something here. So it just seems like it makes sense, at least, and the police and fire, I don't know that that should be a major deal. I just seem like Dan Bly's the one for sure that I would like. It would seem to make sense to run through him.
I think that makes sense. That would also give an opportunity for our absent member to
Okay.
review this further and provide feedback. Okay, Mr. Skelly, if you would circulate that to Mr. Bly, receive his feedback, and then we will bring this back for our next meeting in December.
Thanks, Mike.
Any other old business? Hearing none, we'll move to item F, open discussion. Any items for discussion? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to excuse our absent member.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second that.
Mrs. Town, would you please call the roll?
Chairman Powers,
Yes?
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Mrs. Sickinger,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer.
Yes.
That moves us to a motion to adjourn. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Mrs. Town, would you please call the roll?
Chairman Powers,
Yes.
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Mrs. Sickinger,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer.
Yes.
We conclude our meeting today at 3:52. Thank you, everyone, for your time.